At an elevation of 18,000 feet above the Solomon Islands in August of 1943, Lieutenant Richard Bong bore witness to the catastrophic plummet of his wingman's P-38 Lightning as it spiraled uncontrollably into the vast expanse of the Pacific Ocean. 3 Japanese Zero fighters had ambushed their formation from a superior vantage point. Now, Bong found himself isolated, with the lead Zero rapidly closing in on his tail. He initiated the standard evasive tactic, a sharp right bank executed with full throttle, an attempt to outline the immediate threat. However, the nimble Zero demonstrated its superior agility, turning with unnerving tightness. The enemy pilot was already positioning himself for a lethal firing solution, and Bong had perhaps 4 precarious seconds before the devastating impact of 20mm cannon fire would shred his aircraft. What transpired next was an improvisation entirely absent from any flight training manual. Bong decisively rolled his P-38 completely inverted and forcefully yanked the control stick forward. Instead of ascending away from the peril, his aircraft plunged precipitously towards the ocean. Yet, by executing this maneuver while upside down, he pulled away in an utterly unforeseen vector, one the Zero pilot could not have possibly anticipated. Blood surged violently to his head, his peripheral vision blurred into a crimson haze. For 2 critical seconds, his ability to discern his instruments was severely compromised. When he finally rolled level again at 12,000 feet, the Zero was above him, having overshot its mark, and was now completely out of position. Bong had not only survived this harrowing encounter, but had inadvertently stumbled upon a revolutionary tactic destined to reshape the landscape of air combat throughout the Pacific theater. This audacious maneuver fundamentally contravened every established tenet taught at flight school. Instructors at training bases nestled in California and Arizona had emphatically cautioned against the perils of negative G flight, citing the potential for engine failure, catastrophic structural damage, and pilot incapacitation. The prevailing doctrine was unequivocal on this matter. Nevertheless, in the crucible of actual combat, when an enemy Zero pilot had successfully achieved a firing position, those theoretical warnings faded into insignificance compared to the immediate imperative of survival. The aviators who endured their initial, brutal encounters with Zeros gleaned a stark revelation. Conventional aerial combat doctrine was, in essence, leading American pilots to their demise. Japanese aviators, conversely, had meticulously refined their tactics through years of relentless combat operations over China. They possessed an intimate understanding of every inherent advantage offered by their Mitsubishi A6M. American pilots were perishing because they adhered to pre-war instructional paradigms against an adversary who had long since discarded such rigid rules in favor of practical, battle-hardened strategies. The narrative surrounding inverted flight tactics transcends the typical confines of standard military chronicles. Between the years 1942 and 1944, a select cadre of fighter pilots unearthed profound truths: that the human body could withstand physiological duress deemed intolerable by contemporary aviation medical science, and that their aircraft could endure maneuvers aeronautical designers asserted would precipitate catastrophic structural compromise. Most significantly, these pilots unequivocally proved that, at times, sheer survival necessitated flying directly towards the threat rather than attempting to evade it. This was not the sanitized version of Pacific air combat that subsequently appeared in official after-action reports. This was desperate, brutal innovation born from unrelenting exigency, where split-second decisions served as the razor-thin demarcation between pilots who returned to base and those whose names tragically swelled the casualty lists. The Mitsubishi A6M0 made its operational debut over China in 1940. By the time America formally entered the war in December 1941, Japanese pilots had amassed a formidable wealth of combat experience, meticulously honing their aerial stratagems over thousands of combat hours. The Zero's inherent performance characteristics presented a lethal predicament for Allied airmen. At speeds below 300 miles per hour, the Zero possessed the uncanny ability to outmaneuver almost every opposing fighter aircraft in the sky. Its turning radius at combat speeds was approximately 400 feet tighter than that of a P-38 Lightning, and nearly 500 feet tighter than an F-4F Wildcat. In a conventional close-quarters turning engagement, precisely the kind emphasized in American training programs, a Zero pilot could effortlessly circle inside his opponent's turn and achieve a lethal firing solution within a mere matter of seconds. Early engagement reports emanating from the Philippines and Java painted a somber narrative. American pilots initially attempted boom and zoom tactics, which involved diving on Zeros from altitude, delivering a burst of fire, and then rapidly climbing away. However, if this initial, high-speed attack failed to neutralize the target, the Zero pilot would simply initiate a tight horizontal turn. When the American pilot attempted to follow, he invariably found himself on the outside of the turning circle, rapidly dissipating his kinetic advantage and transitioning from aggressor to quarry. By mid-1942, kill ratios in some operational sectors alarmingly favored Japanese pilots by a margin of 3-1. Squadron commanders were submitting reports that unequivocally stated the same stark reality. We cannot win turning fights against this aircraft. The F-4F Wildcat, predominantly flown by Navy and Marine Corps pilots, possessed commendable diving velocity and could withstand considerable combat damage, but its roll performance was notably lethargic. The P-40 Warhawk exhibited strong performance in vertical maneuvers, but experienced diminished effectiveness at elevated operational ceilings where many aerial engagements transpired. The P-38 Lightning, with its distinctive twin engines and heavy firepower, was nevertheless hampered by an expansive turning circle, which rendered it susceptible in horizontal combat. Each American fighter type boasted specific advantages, be it armament, armor protection, or dive speed, but none could rival the Zero's unparalleled agility in orthodox close-quarters aerial duels. Pilots were consistently advised to leverage their aircraft's unique strengths, rigorously avoid turning engagements, and always strive to maintain an energy advantage. While this constituted sensible advice, the unpredictable chaos of combat seldom conformed to preconceived strategies. What further exacerbated this strategic conundrum was the formidable expertise of Japanese naval aviators in 1942 and early 1943. Many of these veteran pilots had been flying combat missions since the late 1930s. They possessed a consummate proficiency in energy management, precise deflection shooting, and sophisticated formation tactics. Critically, they knew precisely how to compel American aviators into tactical predicaments, where the Zero's turning ability became the decisive factor. A prevalent Japanese stratagem involved one Zero acting as an apparently vulnerable decoy, flying straight and level, feigning susceptibility. When an American pilot committed to the attack, two additional Zeros would suddenly descend from above or slide in from the flanks. The American fighter was abruptly thrust onto the defensive, inevitably forced into a turning fight, at which point the Zero's advantages became insurmountable. The fundamental mathematics underpinning turning combat are unrelenting. Turn radius is inextricably linked to both velocity and the g-force loading experienced by the aircraft. The Zero's aerodynamically optimized, albeit vulnerable, construction, partially realized through the omission of protective armor and self-sealing fuel cells, endowed it with unrivaled turning prowess. American fighters, in contrast, incorporated armor plating behind the pilot's seat, self-sealing fuel tanks, and heavier armament. While these features afforded aviators a crucial measure of protection upon impact, they concurrently added hundreds of pounds to the airframe, which in turn increased wing loading and expanded the aircraft's turning radius. American pilots were essentially tasked with defeating an opponent who owned the most critical advantage in dogfighting, all while operating aircraft that prioritized pilot endurance and airframe resilience over intrinsic aerial agility. The maneuver that would eventually save countless American lives did not originate within the hallowed pages of aeronautical engineering treatises or codified tactical doctrine. Instead, it emerged from a confluence of unadulterated exigency and fortuitous happenstance. The split S, as it came to be known, involved rolling the aircraft completely inverted and then executing a precipitous diving turn by pulling the control stick forward. In the context of normal flight, pilots typically experience positive G-forces. Blood is pushed towards their lower extremities, peripheral vision constricts, and at approximately 5 to 6 gs, many aviators experience grayout or a complete blackout. However, when a pilot rolls upside down and pulls the stick forward, he experiences negative G-forces. Blood rushes violently to the head. This dramatic physiological effect is termed red out, because the visual field literally turns crimson as the retinal capillaries become engorged. Aviation medicine in 1942 posited that human physiology was ill-equipped to withstand significant negative G-forces. Studies conducted at the time indicated that even a relatively mild negative 2 gs caused pronounced physiological distress, profound spatial disorientation, and the looming specter of retinal impairment. Authoritative directives consequently counseled against the complete avoidance of negative G flight. Yet, these studies were meticulously conducted in rigorously controlled laboratory settings, manned by test pilots unburdened by the exigencies of live combat. Actual combat presented a starkly divergent calculus. A pilot enduring a mere 2 seconds of red out, but successfully escaping a zero's gun solution survived. Conversely, a pilot who meticulously maintained perfect positive G-flight but remained squarely within the zero's crosshairs perished. The choice was not between comfort and discomfort. It was between transient sensory impairment and absolute, permanent death. The fundamental physics behind the efficacy of the inverted dive hinged upon judicious energy manipulation and astute anticipation of enemy responses. When a zero pilot achieved a tail position, he invariably presumed the quarry would either attempt an unfeasible turning maneuver or endeavor a power-sapping ascent, which would bleed the American aircraft's energy and render it an easier target. The inverted dive achieved neither of these predictable outcomes. Instead, it ingeniously transformed potential energy, derived from altitude, into kinetic velocity along an utterly unforeseen flight path. More critically, if the Japanese pilot attempted to follow through the same maneuver, his aircraft encountered inherent structural constraints. The Zero was engineered to endure positive G-forces approximating 7 gs, but its lighter construction made sustained negative G-flight particularly dangerous. Attempting to pull negative gs in a Zero risked either catastrophic structural failure or severe engine problems, because the aircraft systems were not designed for prolonged inverted operation. The P-38's twin Allison engines possessed a further, unanticipated operational benefit during negative G flight. Unlike many single-engine fighters with carburetor-equipped power plants, which were susceptible to fuel deprivation during inverted maneuvers, the P-38's engines utilized alternative fuel delivery mechanisms that exhibited superior reliability under negative G loads. This was not a deliberate engineering specification. Lockheed engineers certainly were not planning for inverted combat tactics, but it became strategically pivotal. A P-38 pilot could therefore maintain full power throughout an inverted dive, while some pursuing enemy aircraft might experience momentary power loss, thereby augmenting the critical distance between them. The physiological resilience of the human physique against the rigors of negative G forces proved to be substantially greater than previously posited within conventional medical discourse, provided that the exposure remained transient. Aviators frequently recounted that the alarming phenomenon known as red out, a complete crimsoning of the visual field, persisted for only a fleeting interval of mere seconds during the precise execution of a split-S maneuver. Full visual acuity invariably reinstated itself as the aircraft transitioned back into the realm of positive G flight during the recovery phase. While the physical toll was undeniably severe, manifesting as throbbing headaches, profound facial muscle fatigue, and distinctly bloodshot eyes, it was, crucially, deemed survivable. Several pilots, reflecting on their harrowing experiences during post-mission debriefings, candidly remarked on their preference for enduring an excruciating headache upon their return to base over the grim alternative of a solitary, watery interment at sea. Their informal, yet starkly practical, assessment of the inherent risks was unequivocally straightforward. Negative G maneuvers inflicted temporary suffering, but the lethal precision of Japanese ordnance inflicted permanent demise. Major Thomas Lynch, a distinguished aviator with the 39th Fighter Squadron, operating P-38 Lightnings from the strategic outpost of Port Moresby in New Guinea, holds the distinction of being the inaugural pilot formally documented to have employed the inverted dive tactic with deliberate intent rather than as a mere reflex born of desperation. On the 11th day of April in 1943, Major Lynch was at the helm of a four-plane patrol soaring above the expansive Huon Gulf when his formation unexpectedly encountered a superior force of 80 fighters at an altitude of 20,000 feet. Eschewing the conventional wisdom of engaging in a protracted horizontal turning fight, Lynch, with decisive speed, immediately rolled his aircraft inverted the moment the lead zero closed in on his tail. He then executed a sharp pull-through into a precipitously steep dive, rapidly accelerating his twin-engine fighter to speeds exceeding 400 miles per hour, before leveling out at 8,000 feet. The Zero pilot, who had attempted to maintain pursuit, was compelled to break off his dive at 12,000 feet, evidently either unwilling or physically incapable of matching Lynch's audacious dive angle and blistering speed. Lynch's actions transcended mere survival. He masterfully inverted the tactical situation. Upon regaining level flight, he possessed both a significant altitude advantage and a decidedly superior airspeed. He shrewdly leveraged this newfound energy advantage to climb back into the fray, this time approaching the now disorganized Japanese formation from an advantageous position below. The Zeros, having lost their formation cohesion in their pursuit of what they mistakenly perceived as fleeing American adversaries, were vulnerable. In the ensuing engagement, Lynch skillfully dispatched 2 Zeros. His wingmen, having emulated his audacious inverted dive, emerged from the encounter without sustaining any losses. The subsequent after-action report duly noted the innovative tactic, but, notably, refrained from emphasizing its significance. At that juncture, official aerial combat doctrine steadfastly continued to discourage all forms of negative G maneuvers. The profound import of Lynch's actions resided fundamentally in their intentionality and his strategic foresight. Numerous other pilots had, under the extreme duress of combat, inadvertently rolled inverted, survived the ordeal, and subsequently attributed their escape to sheer fortune. Lynch, however, possessed the acute discernment to recognize this seemingly instinctive reaction as a replicable and highly effective combat technique. Within a remarkably brief span of a single week, he actively commenced instructing other pilots within his squadron on the intricacies of the maneuver during informal, ad hoc briefings. His instruction was characterized by its elegant simplicity and directness. If a Zero manages to position itself firmly on your tail in a situation where conventional evasive maneuvers prove ineffective, immediately roll inverted, execute a decisive pull-through, initiate a hard, steep dive, and exploit the resulting speed to create separation. Do not attempt to outturn him horizontally. Instead, leverage the vertical dimension. The Zero unequivocally dominates the horizontal turning circle, but American fighters, by virtue of their robust design and powerful engines, inherently command the vertical dive. By the arrival of June 1943, the groundbreaking tactic had disseminated widely, reaching other P-38 units stationed across the crucial operational areas of Guadalcanal and the Russell Islands. Pilots enthusiastically exchanged knowledge of the technique during candid discussions in ready rooms and through the informal channels of inter-squadron debriefings. Despite its growing prevalence, the maneuver steadfastly retained its largely unofficial status. It was neither explicitly prohibited nor formally endorsed within the pages of official tactical directives. Squadron leaders, while acutely aware of its demonstrable effectiveness in combat, exhibited a palpable reluctance to commit its instruction to written policy. This hesitation stemmed, in part, from significant liability concerns. Should an aviator perish while attempting to execute the maneuver, uncomfortable questions would inevitably arise regarding the authority that sanctioned the teaching of a tactic that directly contravened established training protocols. Consequently, the technique propagated organically through an intricate network of oral tradition, with seasoned veterans discreetly demonstrating its execution to newer arrivals without ever formally documenting the instruction. The 475th Fighter Group, upon its deployment to the Southwest Pacific Theater in August 1943, received comprehensive informal briefings on the inverted dive tactic from the battle-hardened veterans of the 49th Fighter Group. Major Charles MacDonald, an exceptional aviator who would ultimately distinguish himself as one of the Pacific Theater's most formidable aces with an impressive tally of 27 aerial victories, later unequivocally credited the Split S maneuver with preserving his life on no fewer than 3 distinct combat occasions. His meticulously detailed combat reports from the latter part of 1943 consistently illustrate a discernible operational pattern. Initiate engagements with Zeros from a position of superior altitude, execute a high-speed pass, and then, if subjected to a counterattack during the subsequent climb back to altitude, immediately roll inverted and dive away. The objective was invariably to disengage, and then re-establish the engagement on strategically favorable terms. This was not the artistry of elegant dogfighting. Rather, it represented a brutal, industrial-strength application of survival mathematics that, almost as a beneficial byproduct, consistently yielded victory. The profound physiological toll exacted by negative G-flight was a dimension of aerial combat for which no existing training manual had adequately prepared the pilots. During the execution of a typical Split S maneuver, which involved enduring forces ranging from -2 to -3 gs, the blood pressure within the pilot's cranial region surged dramatically. Pilots consistently reported an instantaneous and intense sensation of pressure directly behind their eyes, swiftly followed by the disorienting, redoubt effect, wherein their entire visual field became saturated with a crimson hue. This intense pressure was a direct consequence of blood vessels within the retina and conjunctiva becoming engorged with blood, forcibly propelled upwards by the powerful negative acceleration. For those critical 2 to 3 seconds, an aviator was, to all practical extents, flying blind, compelled to rely solely on their kinesthetic sense, their ingrained muscle memory, and an intimate familiarity with their instruments to maintain precise control of the aircraft. Flight Surgeon Captain James Moorhead, stationed at the pivotal Henderson Field on Guadalcanal in the latter half of 1943, diligently documented the physical aftermath observed in pilots who routinely employed these inverted dive tactics. His examinations encompassed dozens of aviators, nearly all of whom exhibited clear signs of petechial hemorrhaging, minute, ruptured blood vessels that manifested as an array of tiny red spots across their faces, particularly concentrated around the delicate areas of the eyes and forehead. A notable subset of these pilots experienced more severe subconjunctival hemorrhages, which rendered the whites of their eyes a vivid, blood-red color for periods extending several days. Severe, debilitating headaches were a ubiquitous complaint. A smaller number of aviators reported transient visual disturbances, including blurred sight or persistent difficulty in focusing, symptoms that often lingered for several hours after their return to base. Captain Moorhead's unofficial conclusion, though never formally published in mainstream medical journals, was that while these maneuvers undeniably inflicted measurable physical damage, none of the observed effects appeared to be permanently debilitating. The paramount risk, however, lay not in the physical discomfort, but in the fleeting moment of absolute blindness itself. During those critical few seconds of readout, a pilot was utterly incapable of discerning crucial flight information from his altimeter, airspeed indicator, or attitude instruments. Moreover, he certainly could not visually track the enemy aircraft that might still be pursuing him, nor could he gauge the terrifyingly rapid ascent of the ground below. The maneuver demanded an unyielding and absolute commitment. An aviator was required to establish the precise dive angle, endure the intense negative GS, and then steadfastly maintain that specific control input until his vision miraculously cleared, implicitly trusting that he had accurately judged his altitude. Before initiating the inverted roll for recovery, several catastrophic training accidents tragically occurred when pilots either initiated the maneuver at a dangerously low altitude or prolonged the dive for an excessive duration. There existed no discernible margin for error when executing this maneuver below 5,000 feet. Conversely, at an altitude of 15,000 feet, a pilot was afforded a precious window of time to correct any miscalculations. This critical understanding crystallized into a fundamental mathematical calculation for survival. Under no circumstances should one ever initiate an inverted maneuver below 8,000 feet, unless the alternative was the absolute certainty of death. Experienced pilots, through a process of trial and error and acute observation, developed sophisticated techniques designed to curtail the duration of the readout phenomenon. Some learned to consciously tense their neck and facial muscles, endeavoring to restrict the upward flow of blood to the head. Others discovered that by rolling inverted but applying a less aggressive pull on the control stick, they could achieve a pragmatic trade-off, sacrificing a degree of maximum maneuver performance for the benefit of slightly improved visual retention, thereby maintaining partial sight throughout the execution of the maneuver. This became a critical judgment call in the heat of combat. A maximum negative G input undeniably generated the swiftest possible separation from a tenacious, pursuing zero, but invariably induced a complete and terrifying visual blackout. Conversely, a more moderate negative G input allowed the pilot to retain some crucial visual reference, but at the cost of diminishing the overall effectiveness and speed of the escape. In practical combat scenarios, the overwhelming majority of pilots opted for the maximum separation strategy. It was deemed unequivocally preferable to endure 3 seconds of temporary blindness and emerge alive than to be semi-aware and subsequently shot down. The psychological dimension of this tactic presented an equally formidable challenge. Human beings are endowed with powerful, evolutionarily ingrained instincts that militate against actions causing pain and sensory deprivation, voluntarily inducing temporary blindness, while simultaneously being targeted by an adversary intent on lethal force runs fundamentally counter to every primal survival instinct. Yet, these courageous pilots systematically learned to override that deeply ingrained instinct. The inaugural attempt was undeniably terrifying. The second iteration remained profoundly frightening. However, by the fifth or sixth execution, the maneuver gradually transmuted into merely another unpleasant, albeit necessary, aspect of combat flying, akin to enduring the concussion of anti-aircraft flak, managing critical fuel levels, or witnessing the tragic demise of comrades. The physical body adapted, and, crucially, the human mind adapted in parallel. What might have appeared utterly impossible or unfeasible within the confines of a controlled training environment became a grim, yet routine, necessity when the stark alternative was the catastrophic impact of a 20mm cannon shell tearing through the cockpit. The inverted dive tactic disseminated throughout the vast expanse of the Pacific theater akin to an underground transmission, propagating stealthily from one squadron to another, without ever once gracing the pages of official tactical publications. By September 1943, P-38 units stationed across the entirety of New Guinea and the Solomon Islands were routinely incorporating the teaching of this maneuver into the initial week of orientation for newly arrived replacement pilots. The instruction was characteristically informal. Seasoned veteran pilots would discreetly draw aside new arrivals after the evening mess, imparting invaluable insights into what worked and, perhaps more crucially, what got people killed. Squadron commanders were invariably aware of these unofficial training sessions. Some actively encouraged the practice, recognizing its life-saving potential. Others chose to feign ignorance, meticulously maintaining plausible deniability should 5th Air Force Headquarters ever pose uncomfortable inquiries regarding unauthorized training protocols. Colonel Neil Kirby, the commanding officer of the 348th Fighter Group, operating P-47 Thunderbolts from Port Moresby, took a decisive and unprecedented step by formally incorporating the Split S into his unit's tactical doctrine in October 1943. The P-47, being an even heavier aircraft than the P-38, was rendered hopelessly outmatched in traditional turning combat against the agile Zeros. However, the formidable Thunderbolt possessed an unparalleled ability to dive faster than almost any other aircraft in the sky, and its robust radial engine demonstrated a remarkably resilient tolerance for negative G flight. Kirby's tactical approach was characterized by its unwavering pragmatism. He explicitly communicated to his pilots that any attempt to engage a Zero in a turning fight would inevitably result in their demise. Conversely, he instructed them that by judiciously exploiting the P-47's inherent weight and prodigious power to dictate vertical engagements, commencing with aggressive diving attacks followed by inverted escapes when strategically necessary, they would not only survive, but ultimately prevail. Colonel Kirby himself achieved a remarkable personal feat, shooting down 6 Japanese aircraft on October 11, 1943, by meticulously employing these very tactics. For his extraordinary valor and leadership during that mission, he was subsequently awarded the Medal of Honor. The tactical innovation, initially championed by other fighter types, found a natural home with Marine Corps F-4U Corsair squadrons, which began incorporating these similar techniques into their operational doctrine by early 1944. The formidable Corsair, a single-engine fighter, boasted significant performance advantages over the Japanese Zero across nearly all metrics, with the sole exception of its turning radius. Marine aviators, launching from strategic island outposts such as Munda and Vella La Vella, quickly discovered that the inverted dive proved even more effective and reliable in the Corsair than it had in larger, twin-engine aircraft. This was largely due to the F-4U's robust Pratt & Whitney R2800 engine, an engineering marvel that consistently maintained thrust even through demanding negative G maneuvers. Furthermore, the aircraft's inherent structural integrity provided pilots with the confidence to recover from high-speed dives without the grave concern of experiencing wing failure. Major Robert Gaylor, a pivotal figure in instructing tactics to the renowned VMF 214, famously known as the Black Sheep Squadron, frequently demonstrated this critical maneuver, consistently underscoring its primary role as a defensive escape tactic rather than an offensive weapon to engage the enemy. The tactical innovation gained further traction, disseminating rapidly to Navy carrier squadrons operating throughout the vast Central Pacific by the middle of 1944. Fighter pilots launching from the decks of iconic aircraft carriers, including the USS Essex and the USS Lexington, began receiving comprehensive briefings that formally incorporated inverted maneuvers as an accepted and vital part of their tactical repertoire. While the official terminology for this daring maneuver exhibited some variation, with some airmen referring to it as a split S, others designating it a negative G break, and still others simply describing it as rolling out downward, the precise nomenclature proved inconsequential. The fundamental execution remained universally consistent. In situations where conventional defensive maneuvers proved insufficient to evade an adversary, pilots were explicitly instructed to invert their aircraft and initiate a steep dive. A crucial safety threshold, however, persisted at approximately 8,000 feet. Below this critical altitude, aviators were compelled to seek alternative escape routes or, more grimly, resign themselves to a life-or-death struggle. It was also understood that not every type of aircraft possessed the inherent capabilities to perform this demanding maneuver safely. Observations from the field highlighted specific limitations across different aircraft types. Navy F-6F Hellcat pilots, for instance, frequently reported instances where their carbureted engines would intermittently cough or even cease functioning altogether during periods of sustained inverted flight, although these power plants typically restarted with commendable swiftness. Concurrently, Army Air Forces P-40 pilots discovered that while their aircraft possessed the structural integrity to withstand the rigors of the inverted maneuver, they conspicuously lacked the requisite dive performance to generate adequate separation from relentlessly pursuing Zero fighters. These inherent limitations underscored a critical reality. Tactical applications remained distinctly aircraft-specific. Consequently, a P-38 pilot could confidently integrate the inverted dive as a primary defensive instrument within their arsenal. In stark contrast, a P-40 pilot was compelled to explore and employ an entirely different set of escape options to ensure their survival. Nevertheless, the fundamental principle underpinning these novel tactics had by this point achieved universal acceptance and application throughout the entire theater of operations. The unequivocal truth emerged: vertical maneuvers, encompassing inverted flight whenever circumstances necessitated, consistently triumphed over traditional horizontal turning engagements. Inevitably, Japanese pilots began to discern the characteristic American inverted dive tactic and subsequently endeavored to devise effective countermeasures. By the close of 1943, combat reports meticulously compiled from returning Zero pilots frequently made mention of American fighters abruptly rolling inverted and plunging away at considerable velocities. The initial Japanese assessments, however, interpreted this as a purely defensive maneuver, erroneously perceiving it as irrefutable evidence that American pilots harbored an aversion to close-quarters combat and were, in essence, fleeing rather than engaging. This profoundly flawed interpretation proves strategically perilous, for Japanese airmen, as it inadvertently reinforced their entrenched tactical doctrine, while simultaneously causing them to entirely overlook the genuine threat posed by this evolving American strategy. Far from being a mere retreat, the inverted dive functioned as a tactical reset, empowering American pilots to meticulously select the optimal moment and method for re-engaging the enemy on terms distinctly advantageous to them. In a misguided attempt to neutralize this new American advantage, some Japanese pilots audaciously endeavored to pursue American fighters through their inverted dives. The consequences of such actions, regrettably, were frequently fatal. The Zero's distinctive lightweight construction, a characteristic that endowed it with unparalleled turning performance, ironically transformed into a significant liability during the high-speed vertical maneuvers demanded by the new American tactics. The aircraft's airframe, meticulously engineered and stressed primarily for positive G limits, possessed markedly reduced safety margins when subjected to the stresses of negative G flight. This inherent design flaw led to dire outcomes. Numerous Zero pilots, who valiantly attempted to shadow P-38s through aggressive inverted dives, reported experiencing severe control surface flutter, or, in more catastrophic instances, outright structural failure of their aircraft. Furthermore, another critical vulnerability emerged. Their Nakajima Sakai engines frequently encountered debilitating fuel delivery problems during inverted flight, precipitating a catastrophic loss of power at the most inopportune moment, precisely in the middle of a dive, while desperately striving to maintain visual contact with an elusive enemy aircraft. A particularly illuminating and well-documented incident from December 1944, occurring high above Leyte Gulf, served as a stark illustration of the inverted dive tactic's profound lethality when Zero pilots unwisely attempted to counter it. Lieutenant Colonel Thomas McGuire, skillfully piloting a P-38 Lightning, found himself embroiled in a fierce engagement with a quartet of Zeros at an altitude of 18,000 feet. The moment the lead Zero maneuvered into a precarious firing position, McGuire executed a swift inverted roll and plunged into a steep dive. The determined Japanese pilot, in turn, attempted to mirror the maneuver, striving to keep McGuire squarely within his gun sight. At this critical juncture, two pivotal events unfolded almost simultaneously. McGuire's robust P-38 rapidly accelerated beyond 450 miles per hour during its descent, maintaining complete structural integrity, while the pursuing Zero began to suffer from severe and alarming vibrations once it reached approximately 380 miles per hour. Faced with the imminent danger of catastrophic airframe failure, the Japanese pilot was left with no recourse but to terminate his pursuit prematurely. McGuire, having successfully created substantial separation, leveled his aircraft at 6,000 feet, then skillfully climbed back into the fray, now possessing a decisive energy advantage, ultimately succeeding in shooting down two of the four Zeros. The remaining two enemy aircraft, recognizing their tactical disadvantage, promptly disengaged from the combat. The core dilemma confronting Japanese pilots stemmed from the unfortunate reality that their most celebrated and effective combat aircraft, the Zero, had become tragically optimized for an obsolete form of aerial combat by the latter half of 1944. In the initial phases of the war, when aerial engagements predominantly unfolded at medium altitudes and involved protracted, intricate turning fights, the Zero's inherent characteristics were undeniably ideal, granting it a formidable edge. However, as American tactics underwent a profound evolution, shifting decisively towards high-speed slashing attacks and dynamic vertical maneuvers, the Zero's once decisive advantages rapidly became strategically irrelevant. Conversely, its previously acceptable disadvantages, a notable lack of protective armor, its inherently lightweight structural design, and a comparatively lower dive speed, metamorphosed into critical and exploitable vulnerabilities. Japanese aircraft designers were not entirely oblivious to this burgeoning problem. Subsequent later Model 0 variants and innovative newer designs, such as the J2M Raiden, did indeed feature enhanced dive performance and more robust structural integrity. Regrettably, these improved aircraft were deployed in severely limited numbers and arrived far too late in the conflict to exert any meaningful alteration on the overarching tactical balance of power. Compounding these material deficiencies, Japanese training programs proved woefully incapable of adapting with sufficient alacrity to the rapidly shifting realities of aerial warfare. By 1944, the Empire of Japan was hemorrhaging its cadre of experienced and irreplaceable pilots at an unsustainable rate. Consequently, newly minted pilots were shunted through severely abbreviated training curricula that primarily focused on imparting rudimentary flight skills and the now outmoded traditional dogfighting tactics. Critically, there was neither the available time nor the precious fuel resources to impart advanced energy management principles or the complex vertical combat techniques that were becoming increasingly vital. In stark contrast, American training programs had, by this period, judiciously incorporated invaluable lessons gleaned directly from their seasoned combat veterans. As a result, replacement pilots arriving in the Pacific Theater in late 1944 possessed a comprehensive understanding of inverted dive tactics even before they embarked upon their inaugural combat mission. The profound knowledge gap had, by this juncture, completely reversed. Japanese pilots, who had once stood as the most experienced and formidable aviators in the entire theater, were now frequently the least adequately prepared for the brutal realities of the war's actual tactical environment. These ingenious inverted dive tactics, forged in the crucible of desperate aerial combat over the Pacific between 1943 and 1945, did not simply vanish with the cessation of hostilities in World War II. Instead, they became indelibly embedded within the foundational doctrine of fighter tactics, albeit frequently without explicit attribution to the urgent, life-saving innovations pioneered by P-38 and Corsair pilots, who were quite literally fighting for their very survival. Contemporary fighter combat training, particularly at esteemed institutions such as the Navy Fighter Weapons School, universally recognized as Top Gun, now routinely incorporates negative G maneuvers as an indispensable component of standard defensive tactics. While the precise terminology has naturally evolved over time, with modern aviators referring to it as a negative G pushover or an unloaded roll, the fundamental physics governing the maneuver and its core purpose remain absolutely identical to the groundbreaking concept that Thomas Lynch first intuited and successfully applied over the challenging skies of New Guinea in April 1943. The efficacy of these innovative tactics was once again underscored during the Korean War, where American pilots found themselves employing remarkably similar strategies against the formidable MiG-15s. This Soviet-built jet fighter, boasting exceptional high-altitude performance and an ability to outturn the majority of American aircraft in horizontal engagements, presented a significant challenge. Consequently, F-86 Sabre pilots, confronting problems eerily analogous to those previously encountered by P-38 pilots battling Zeros, instinctively resorted to vertical maneuvers and negative G escape techniques whenever MiGs managed to secure an advantageous combat position. Captain Joseph McConnell, who emerged as the top American ace of the Korean War with a remarkable 16 aerial victories, explicitly attributed his survival in several harrowing engagements to what he described as rolling out underneath pursuing MiGs, a descriptive phrase that encapsulated precisely the same inverted dive concept, now skillfully adapted and applied to the high-speed, high-altitude realm of jet combat, often unfolding at 40,000 feet and speeds approaching 600 miles per hour. The critical importance of these fundamental aerial combat lessons was, regrettably, rediscovered through arduous experience by Vietnam-era fighter pilots. In the nascent stages of that protracted conflict, American aviators, whose training had predominantly focused on beyond visual range missile combat, found themselves unexpectedly thrust into intense, close-range dogfights against the agile MiG-17s and MiG-21s. The initial outcomes of these engagements proved disappointingly poor. It was this sobering reality that ultimately led to the pivotal establishment of Top Gun, the Navy Fighter Weapons School, in 1969 at Naval Air Station Miramar. This institution's creation represented a profound institutional acknowledgement that traditional dogfighting skills, including the mastery of negative-G defensive maneuvers, retained their critical importance even amid significant technological advancements in aerospace. Instructors at Top Gun meticulously imparted tactical principles that Pacific War veterans would have instantly recognized. Effectively leverage your aircraft's inherent strengths, assiduously avoid playing into the enemy's advantages, and when forced onto the defensive, decisively employ vertical and inverted maneuvers if the situation demands it. Today's cutting-edge fighter aircraft are meticulously engineered with comprehensive negative-G capability integrated into their very design. Contemporary platforms such as the F-16, the F/A-18, and the advanced F-35 all feature sophisticated fuel systems, innovative engine designs, and formidable structural strength that collectively permit sustained negative-G flight without encountering the severe operational limitations that so vexed World War II-era aircraft. Furthermore, modern pilots undergo rigorous training in specialized centrifuges, systematically building their physiological tolerance for the extreme forces of both positive and negative Gs. The disorienting and once terrifying redoubt effect, which presented a significant hazard to pilots in 1943, is now a thoroughly understood and entirely manageable physiological phenomenon. Crucially, however, the fundamental tactical principle underpinning these maneuvers remains unaltered. Negative-G flight continues to enable pilots to execute maneuvers that adversaries least anticipate, thereby effectively creating vital separation and opening up invaluable opportunities for a decisive counterattack. What truly distinguishes this pivotal Pacific War innovation as profoundly remarkable is its entirely organic genesis, occurring completely outside the confines of official channels and bureaucratic processes. No aeronautical engineer meticulously designed this tactic, nor did any formal tactical development board formally approve its adoption. Indeed, no training command saw fit to incorporate it into their official syllabi until well after intrepid pilots had unequivocally demonstrated its effectiveness through hundreds of intense combat engagements. Instead, this invaluable knowledge disseminated virally through the informal warrior network, with battle-hardened, experienced pilots diligently imparting crucial survival skills to new arrivals, spreading person to person, and squadron to squadron. The courageous men who originally conceived and refined these life-saving tactics rarely received recognition, extending beyond their immediate units. Most, in fact, never comprehended the profound impact their improvised solutions would have, shaping fighter combat doctrine for the subsequent 80 years. Legendary figures like Richard Bong, America's top ace with an astounding 40 victories, survived the brutal conflict in part because he masterfully commanded vertical combat and exhibited no apprehension about flying inverted when exigency demanded. Tragically, Thomas Lynch, credited with intentionally employing the tactic for the first time, was killed in action over the Philippines in March 1944, a loss not attributable to the failure of his brilliant tactics, but rather to the inherently and statistically lethal nature of combat flying, irrespective of an individual's skill. Their enduring legacy is not enshrined in medals or official accolades. Rather, it resonates in the undeniable fact that fighter pilots today continue to rigorously train to roll inverted and push negative G when confronted with a defensive imperative. This represents a direct and unbroken lineage, stretching back to those desperate, mid-flight innovations born in the cockpits over the Pacific, where survival itself demanded a radical rewriting of the established rules of engagement.